Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. We've got a really interesting episode for you today, I certainly hope so. I call this one Extraterrestrial Rendezvous, 5 amazing onboard UFO encounters. I love the onboard UFO cases more than pretty much any other type of UFO encounter, particularly because these are the closest of all UFO encounters. These are the most extensive cases. These are the cases that I think are certainly the most interesting and contain the most information about ETs and what it's like to have extraterrestrial contact. And I've chosen 5 cases that in particular are super interesting because the witnesses were able to have interactive conversations with the extraterrestrials. So we learn quite a bit about the ETs in these particular cases. These cases also cover a pretty significant period of time, 4 decades, from the 60s all the way up through the 1990s, and again come from all over the world, giving us a cross-cultural perspective. So I have a case from England, I have a case from Italy, one from Brazil in South America, and 2 from the United States. These are all single witness cases. However, pretty much all of them, or certainly most of them, do have what I would call supporting witnesses or evidence in terms of other people seeing UFO activity in that area at that time. And of course, there's other types of evidence, such as landing traces, physiological effects, and these sort of things, animal reactions, and so forth. So yeah, some really interesting cases. Most of these I think you probably haven't heard of before. There is one that's quite well known, did get a lot of attention, but I think it's so interesting that if you haven't heard about it, you certainly should have. So let's just get started because yeah, these are extensive cases. And the first one I'd like to talk about is probably the briefest of all 5 of these, but still pretty interesting. And I call this one A Message to Humanity. This occurred on April 10, 1962 in San Casciano, Italy. It's a super interesting, if somewhat controversial case involving an Italian tailor. Primary witness in this case is Mario Zuccala. He's a 27-year-old tailor, married with 4 children, and on the evening of April 10, 1962, he had just gotten off the bus and was returning to his home from his place of employment, and he was walking around the local cemetery in San Casciano, Italy, when he says he was struck from behind by an abnormally powerful gust of air. He says it was almost powerful enough to lift him off his feet. And turning around to see what was the cause, he was paralyzed with fear, he said, to see a 32-foot wide white metallic flying saucer hovering only a few feet off the ground. It wasn't quite landed, it was hovering just a few feet off the ground. And he says he was unable to move and watched in shock as this sort of metallic cylinder about 3 feet wide came out from the bottom of the object and descended, kind of telescoping to the ground. And at this point, a door or an opening appeared in the cylinder and it emitted an intense white light. And he says 2 small men, quote, about 4.5 feet tall, came out and stepped down a few steps and approached Mario. He said that they were pretty much humanoid in form, but were completely covered by an armor of shining metal. They had a strange hood over their head with what looked like 2 antenna-like devices on either side and were wearing gloves. He could not see their faces. Now Mario said at this point his fear completely left him and instead he felt a quote, absolute tranquility. He says the ETs walked right up to him, grabbed him by his armpits and lifted him bodily off the ground and took him inside the craft. Now, he doesn't have a whole lot of memory of what the inside of the craft looked like, other than it was a very bright light. He saw no source of the light, but there was not a whole lot in there, he said. So he asked them where they came from, and they did not reply. But he says at this point he heard a loud voice. He said it sounded almost like it was coming from a loudspeaker, kind of metallic sounding, echoing, and coming from one of the beings, telling him in his native language of Italian, quote, "At the end of the fourth moon, about 1 hour from morning, we will return to give a message to humanity. We shall give notice of this to another person in order to confirm that that which you have seen is true." So it's a pretty brief message there, and the next thing Mario knew, he was being escorted out of the object, and he doesn't know how, but he found himself standing in front of the door to his home with no idea how he got there. His wife, Franciscina, found him there, saying that she heard 4 knocks on the door. Now, Mario does not remember knocking on the front door, but she opened the door, found him there, saw that he was terrified, and Mario was quite traumatized, he said. He was unable to sleep that night. He was not planning on talking about this to anybody, but he did tell it to a friend who called the newspaper. So this led to an investigation. There were no landing traces found at the site. However, Mario said that he was contacted later and was given half of this supposed message, which he said he kept in a locked case, unrevealed. He said the second half of the message, ETs told him, had been given to someone else in Europe. And apparently, according to him, they showed him the face of this person so he would recognize them. And this is pretty much where the case stands. It was investigated by a gentleman by the name of, let me see if I can get this right, Ceccarelli Silvano, who said of Mario, and I quote, "He speaks with a calm assurance of what he has seen." Now, there are some who remain skeptical of his account, but those who know him say he is an honest and sincere man. And in fact, there is some interesting corroboration to his case, because there was another case not too far away which occurred on that same evening. It involved 4 gentlemen, Iler Benazzi and 3 others, who were driving along the Serrano-Legagno road, and they stopped their car to view this unusual glowing object in the sky. And as they watched it, they could see this wasn't a plane or helicopter or anything. It was totally silent. It had 3 white lights on it. And as they're watching it, it dove down towards their car and then landed on the road in front of them before taking off. They were not going to tell anyone about this until they heard about Mario's encounter in the newspapers. And this is when they told the police. So certainly some interesting corroboration there, though not really evidence or proof of Mario's encounter. Again, Mario would report other encounters, and some Italian ufologists began to question the legitimacy of some of his claims, but it's certainly an interesting experience, and Mario has stuck to his story to the day he died. While there are those who do remain skeptical of Mario's account, I don't know. A lot of the details he describes are certainly ones we hear quite often, and by all accounts, from the people who know him, he is an honest and sincere gentleman. So you can just make up your own mind about it. The case was cited in a few books and is certainly worth knowing. And here's another case which is also super interesting, very extensive, has a lot of information, and I call this one, "We Are Here to Help." This got a lot of attention in the area where it occurred, Brazil. It occurred on June 23rd, 1976, in the town of Aracanduva. This is in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And it's amazing. It's an amazing case because It involves quite a bit of evidence, some really unusual features, and just some really interesting takeaways from it. So this amazing, extensive, and very well verified and investigated case does involve, again, multiple corroborating witnesses. But the primary witness is Paulo Coutinho, and it was around 11:30 p.m., June 23rd, 1976. Paulo had just left his girlfriend's house after attending school with her and was walking home. So as he walked along the sidewalk of Moises Marques Street in front of the Church of Sao Pedro, he saw a strange light moving overhead and away from him. But it was unusual, so he stopped to watch it when suddenly it reversed its trajectory and zoomed towards him. And this is when he realized that this light appeared to be targeting him, and he became afraid. He turned to run, but found himself unable to move. And in about 2 seconds, the light dropped down to the sidewalk, about 18 feet away from him, quite close. He could now see it was a small, luminous sphere. It slowly dimmed in brilliance, and in its place was a small, dwarf-like humanoid, about 3 feet tall. Paulo gave a very vivid description. He said that this figure had an enormous bald head, large blue eyes, an upturned nose, a very small mouth, white pale skin, and the figure was wearing a smooth blue-gray jumpsuit with a strange emblem on its chest. Now, for the next 2 or 3 minutes, Paulo and this humanoid faced each other, and then Paulo found himself walking right up to the humanoid, and the next thing he knows, both he and this little man rise slowly up into the air. He says it took about 10 to 15 seconds for them to reach a height of about 90 feet, and then both shot up at a dizzying pace, very fast. And Paulo looked down and watched the earth recede until it was just a small globe. And in front of him, hanging in space, he saw this huge, sparkling red, cigar-shaped object. He estimates it was about 700, maybe 800 feet long, and he's not sure how, but somehow he and this humanoid were drawn inside the craft into a small room, about 9 feet wide, square-ish, with light gray walls that curved into the floor and ceiling. Paulo was lying on the floor. There were 2 other humanoids in there, looking pretty much the same as the first. What's really interesting is while this room was 9 feet wide, it was only 4 feet high. Paulo was 5 feet 7 inches tall, so he was unable to stand up in this room. At this point, he's wondering what's happening to him. Is he hallucinating, dreaming, or imagining all this? So he reached out to touch one of the ETs, at which point he found himself absolutely unable to move, and one of the ETs spoke telepathically to him, saying, "We are not going to do anything to you, so don't try to do anything against us." And then one of the ETs said, "Follow us." 2 of these little, kind of typical grays walked ahead, and one walked on his right. Paulo found himself able to move, but unable to stand up. He kind of hobbled on his knees towards the wall, where a mysterious opening appeared. And they walked into another room, again with a 4-foot-tall ceiling, but much bigger, about 30 feet wide, again with curved walls. Inside, there were 6 more humanoids, so now there's a total of 9 of them. Also in the room was a table. He kind of walked up, or hobbled on his knees up to the table until one of the humanoids told him to just remain where he was. So at this point, Paulo knows he's awake. He knows this is really happening. He felt considerable fear. He could feel the sweat pouring off his body. But he did get a good look at the ETs. You could see that they were basically humanoid. They had 5 fingers, small pointed ears. Some appeared to have more delicate features, and he had the impression that they were female and the others male. He saw that they had large shoes, silver with kind of thick soles on them. So he's freaking out. At this point, he's thinking about his girlfriend and how she was the last person to see him, when to his surprise, the wall before him kind of lit up like a TV screen, only it was in 3 dimensions. It looked absolutely real, and he could see an image of his girlfriend walking down the street. The scene shifted, and he saw 2 classmates from school on their motorcycles. So Paulo was looking at all this pensively with some sadness. He thought of his parents, would they ever see him again? And the image changed to show his mother and father inside their home. Now his mother was crying, his father looked quite worried. So Paulo's getting a little bit angry at this point. He feels like he's being taken away from his family and those he loved. And he spoke out loud to the ETs, "What do you want with me?" Now the ETs did not speak out loud. They replied telepathically, and one of them said, "Don't worry, we won't hurt you." Paulo asked, "What do you come to do here on Earth?" And the ET replied, "We are studying how life arose on the planets and in the universe. We are also here to help." So this intrigued Paulo, and some of his fear lessened, and he started asking them questions. He asked them, "Does God exist?" And the ET replied yes, though Paulo had the impression that he wasn't sure if the ET fully understood the question. But next, they showed him this 3D image of the docking of the Russian and Americans in space, which, by coincidence or not, Paulo had previously seen in school. Paulo did ask them then what they thought of Earth's technology, and the ET replied, and I quote, "If all countries on the planet joined their efforts in common, the result would have a much greater scope." So this is a message of peace, which I found very interesting. Paulo asked to see the Earth, and the image on the screen shifted immediately to show the Earth, first quite close up and then receding quickly. Paulo asked them if they ever used robots or robotic technology, and the ETs replied no, but that each of them, meaning the ETs, were specifically prepared to do the tasks that they were now doing. So Paulo asked them a very interesting question, again out loud. He said, "Why don't the aliens descend en masse on Earth?" And the ETs gave a very interesting response. They said that as long as the people of Earth remained divided, such an action would provoke war. They would only land when the people of Earth joined together. They did tell him that there were millions of other planets with life out in the universe which they were currently researching and visiting. And at one point they showed him what looked like a star map. Now at this point, one of the female ETs walked up to the wall. It opened up and let her out. Paulo could see a corridor lit with red light, but this opening closed again. She returned moments later with another ET, and Paulo was then instructed to follow this ET who had just entered the room into the previous room which he had just exited. So he followed 3 of the ETs into this room, and in it he saw that there was sort of a stretcher floating right above the floor. And Paulo's body floated right onto the stretcher, and this new ET was apparently a doctor because he began to run his hands above Paulo's body as if examining him. This is what Paulo thought was happening, so he asked, and he was told that this new ET was in fact a doctor and that they were examining him. Paulo asked if they were going to do any type of surgery on him, and they said no, that they did not need to open his body, that they could do whatever they needed to do without resorting to those measures. The next thing he knows, he's floating off of this table and he feels this strong, crushing pressure enveloping his entire body. And boom, he found himself outside the craft with the same humanoid who had brought him in. He became very dizzy, his vision blurred, felt a bit nauseous, and then saw a whirlwind of lights and blacked out. So meanwhile, back on Earth, the next morning has arrived, and Paulo is not there. However, one of Paulo's fellow students found his notebooks, his school notebooks, on the ground, apparently exactly where he had been taken on board. So this student took these notebooks and returned it to Paul's home. And this is when Paulo's parents realized that their son was missing under very mysterious circumstances. And throughout the day, family and friends gathered at the house, and they were wondering where he was and what was going on. And when evening arrived, Paulo's father, Jose, got a telepathic message. He felt a sudden, very strong conviction that his son was all right and would be returning shortly. And it was shortly later that one of the members of the household heard a groaning coming from outside. They rushed outside, and there was Paulo, groaning, lying on the ground, cold, semi-conscious. Paulo has no memory of this, really. Next thing he remembers is basically waking up in the hospital. It was the next day, June 24th, and Paulo had been missing for 20 hours. He was rushed to the emergency room at Tutuape, and he was traumatized, but physically fine. He did notice that following this encounter, in the days and weeks afterwards, he started to hear a strange ringing and buzzing noise in his head. He wondered if it might be a type of mental communication with the ETs. There were other changes. Before his encounter, he was a somewhat nervous person. He suffered from stuttering. But following this encounter, he says he had a much calmer outlook on life, and his stuttering disappeared. During his onboard encounter, Paula did have a mechanical pen and pencil in his pocket. These were tested by researchers and were shown to be magnetized. But weirdly, his watch, which he was also wearing, showed no other abnormality other than being 20 hours behind. So investigators really dug into this case, interviewed him thoroughly, interviewed other people in the area, and found out that several people had seen a UFO on that night. Some reported weird disturbances on their TV sets. And in the months following the encounter, Paulo's family saw UFOs overhead. Now here's another very interesting fact. Maria Coutinho, Paulo's mother, said that on the day that Paulo was born, she actually saw a metallic sphere flying in the sky, which was also observed by Paulo's older brother, then 8 years old. So this, I think, is an indication that Paulo's encounter was not a one-off. They had likely been followed pretty much his entire life. A truly fascinating case by any account. And it's really interesting because the ETs did talk about why they're here on this planet and gave the witness quite a bit of information. Certainly deserves to be well known, and that's why I wanted to cover it in this episode. And now we move to another case which I doubt you've heard of. It's not very well known at all. I call this one, You Are Progressing as Planned. And this is an interesting case for a number of reasons, because it shows how closely ETs are observing and working with certain people. This one occurred on February 10, 1981 in Renton, Washington. This is a typical missing time encounter which was uncovered through hypnotic regression, but what the witness recalled certainly matches what other people are remembering fully consciously. I think it's a legitimate case, and I hope you find it interesting. Again, the witness in this case has requested full anonymity and is known only as Kathy. I believe that is a pseudonym. At any rate, she, at the time of her encounter, was a 25-year-old medical professional and a college graduate. But she revealed her story to reporter Doug Margeson of the Auburn, Washington Globe News because she felt that she was not alone with her experiences and wanted others who might be afraid to know that they are not alone with their experiences. and it was around 11:40 p.m. on February 10, 1981, and Kathy was driving along the Petrovitsky Road. Again, this is in Renton, Washington, and she had just passed the Valley General Hospital. She was at the intersection of 151st and Petrovitsky, pictured here, and she looked up in the sky and saw this weird ring of red and blue lights flashing in this sort of sequence. And looking up at this, she could see that whatever this was, it was about 75 to 100 feet in diameter and very low, hovering just above a grove of trees. So she was nearly home at this point. She turned left onto 151st and drove just a short distance to her apartment building and parked. She looked around for the UFO and saw that it was now hovering about 150 feet off the ground, about 200 feet away, apparently following her to her home. And she thought to herself, if this moves or drops, I'm getting out of here. And of course, the object did drop in a sort of falling leaf motion down to an altitude of about 20 to maybe 50 feet. It then stopped and came zooming right for her. This freaked her out. She ran out of the car, leaving the headlights still on, and ran for her front door. Now, turning around, she saw that she had left her headlights on, and for some strange reason, she felt compelled to go back into the car, get in, and turn off the headlights, which she did. And she got out, ran for her door, which was about 75 feet away, and when she looked up, the UFO was gone. She thought this was strange because she didn't see it leave. And after thinking about it, she wondered if there was more to this encounter than she remembered. So she did her research, and the next day she contacted Eileen Garat of the UFO Contact Center International. And after interviewing her, Eileen agreed with Kathy and suspected that she may have had missing time, and Eileen suggested hypnosis. Eileen did the hypnosis, Kathy agreed, and had 4 hypnotic sessions, which did, of course, reveal that she had been taken on board. Kathy recalled that after she sat down in her car to turn off the headlights, the car suddenly filled with bright white light, and the next thing she knew, without knowing how she got there, she was standing inside a dome-like room, 15 feet wide. She said the walls were very smooth, very white. She saw an arched doorway in front of her. In the room there was sort of this white box which held a dark screen which had a bunch of colored lights on it. She also saw a long white table which was connected to the floor by a single pedestal. This was right behind her. And she didn't feel any real fear. She said she felt, quote, calm but kind of bewildered. And she was surprised to find herself undressing, at which point 2 beings came through the arched door. And she described them. She said they were about 4.5 to 5 feet tall, with thin upper bodies, sloping shoulders, and long arms that came down almost to their knees. They had large, kind of light bulb shaped heads, very large wide eyes, just a small ridge for a nose, a slit for a mouth, and a tiny flap and a hole for ears. She did notice that they had only 4 fingers, very long fingers, on each hand. Their skin was gray-white, kind of cool to the touch, she said, and they were dressed from the neck down in, quote, a blue spray metallic fabric. She also noticed that on the left chest of their uniforms was an insignia that looked to her like an isosceles triangle inside a white circle. So these appear to be the typical grays. They held her by her upper arms and led her to this table. And as Kathy says, the whole thing seemed to go like clockwork. I got on the table, and they gently pushed me down. I wasn't frightened. I had no real thoughts. Now at this point, she did see a 3rd humanoid, and he was much the same as the other 2, but wore a red-orange uniform with a black stripe around the neck. He and the other two beings surrounded the table, and the one in the red-orange uniform, she says, held a silver instrument that looked a little bit like a mallet. He placed it on her abdomen in a few spots, and he would look down through the other end, apparently examining her. He left for a moment and then returned, and Kathy spoke to them. She asked them mentally, "What is the purpose of this?" And the ET replied, "You are progressing physically and mentally as planned, and are very receptive to us." They told her that they were pleased with what her father had taught her, and that it was now time to go. And as Kathy says in her own words, "I didn't want to, but they assisted me off the table. I put my dress on. They said, 'You will see us again.' And the next thing I knew, I was back in my car." So, after all the sessions were complete, Kathy remembered that she and her father used to watch UFOs in the sky when she was just a little girl. She decided she was going to call her father and share what happened to her. And she did, and she was amazed by his reaction. As she says, "He cried. He never told me before, but he has had 4 encounters with the same people." So this is a fairly typical case, and it shows the very commonly reported physical exam by the ETs. It also shows that contact is often generational. Kathy doesn't know why she was chosen, but she knows that many people still remain very skeptical of such accounts, but she says she's confident in what happened to her and what she remembered. And as she says, "Think what you want. I believe it." The fact that this witness insisted upon anonymity, is not looking for any attention whatsoever, I think argues towards the credibility of the case. And again, it matches what so many other people have said. It's a really fascinating case. And so is this next one. I think of all the cases I'm presenting today, this might be the most fascinating. It's certainly the most well known. If you haven't heard of it, you definitely should know about it, because it's a fantastic case. I call this one, "You Are Too Old." This occurred on August 12, 1983 in England, near Aldershot, England. And it involves a gentleman who is 77 years old and had an onboard experience unlike any other I've actually heard about, though in many ways it is a fairly typical encounter. In some ways, it's absolutely unique, and I think you'll find it quite fascinating. It was around 1 a.m., and Alfred Berthoud, a retired gardener, age 77, sat with his dog Tiny on the banks of a canal near Aldershot, England. Again, this is August 12, 1983. Alfred was getting his fishing pole and bait ready for an early morning of fishing, and he was just pouring a cup of tea when a UFO showed up. And I'll just quote Alfred because he described what happened next in very vivid detail. As Alfred says in his own words, "I saw a light suddenly appear from the south, so I put my cup down on the box and stood and watched it. It came in towards the railway bridge, and I thought, it's not going to land on the railway bridge. I straightaway guessed that it wasn't an airplane or a chopper, because it was only about 300 feet off the ground. Then it settled down further along the towpath, and the brilliant light that had been showing was extinguished. I stood there watching it, and presently I saw 2 forms coming towards me. The dog growled and wouldn't pack up until I told it to. 2 forms came up to me, just over 4 feet high, I would say, dressed in green overalls and visors. I stood there looking at them, and they stood there looking at me. I got a bit of a shock when they came up to me with those green overalls on. I couldn't see any buttons or zips or anything. It was just as though it was molded onto them. The dog sat there quietly after I told it to shut up. They had like pea green helmets on their heads, but the visor on front seemed to be blacked out, like smoked glass. You couldn't see their faces. I didn't notice their hands, maybe they had gloves on. But then the chap on the right waved for me to come, and that was all. I was curious, so I followed them. Well, when we got down to within 50 to 60 yards of the railway bridge, there was this object sitting on the towpath, 10 to 15 feet over the water and 10 to 15 feet over the bank. The outside was like polished aluminum. There were steps. They were off-line to the towpath, and we had to step onto the grass to go up to them. They were just a wide set of steps with a handrail up both sides. So, at this point, the ETs climb up the steps. Alfred follows. Alfred did notice that as they walked up to this craft, the ETs did seem a bit stiff in their movements, and they led him up to and into this craft, which he said was about 45 feet wide. It had sort of a top dome, portholes around the center, 6 or 7 that he could see. And of course there were about 5 to 10 steps leading up to a height he estimates of about 12 to 15 feet. And as Alfred says in his own words, one went ahead of me because that is the way they walked down the path, and one behind me. One of these forms went across the corridor, which was hexagon in shape, and the other one stood near the door. I stood to the right of him. So he stood there quite some time as if they were preparing for something, and as Alfred says, the one in front of me walked across what I would call the corridor into what I took to be a room on the other side, and the other one just stood inside the door, and I stood to the right of him. So again, he's standing right there for quite some time. He said it was warmer inside the craft than outside. He noticed a faint but unpleasant smell, somewhat, he said, like decaying meat. He also noticed that the interior was dimly lit, but he could see no actual light source. As Alfred says in his own words, there was a light. It was very dim and everything appeared black. That's the funny part. I didn't see anything like that, meaning a light. But there was a light in there. Whether it was around the ridge of the ceiling, the inside of the craft was all black. When I walked across the floor, I didn't hear my own footsteps, so I got the impression that there was some sort of cloth down on the floor. The ceiling was only about 5 feet high, and it was as much as I could do to get into it. I am 5 foot 4½ inches, so they were a shade shorter than I am. I had to bob down going into the door. And the light was good enough to see where we were going, but once we got inside, there was a dim light. But this must have been due to the blackness of it. Presently a voice said in broken English, "Come over and stand under the amber light." Well, right in the center of the floor, there was a column that went up about 4 feet in circumference. This column that was in the middle of the floor, there was a Z-shaped handle on it, such as you might see on a well, and there was a form, a being, standing on either side of that. There were 2 different forms from those that had accompanied me along the canal path. I took it to be these 2 forms were standing by, ready to wind the gear that drove it, but that is only my suspicion. At first I couldn't see an amber light, but when I stepped to one side I could see the light on the wall. I walked over and stood under the light, and this voice asked me to come over and stand under the light, asked me, "What is your age?" I said, "I shall be 78 next birthday." So at this point, says Alfred, there was a pause. The ET said in a kind of sing-song voice, "Turn around." Alfred obeyed. He turned around, faced the wall, remained there, he said, for a good 5 minutes. He was able to get a good look at the craft at this point and was very much impressed by its flawless construction. As Alfred says, whoever built that thing certainly made a good job of it, There were no nuts, bolts, joints, or welds that I could see. I reckon I was in there a good half hour. I had to wait for a while with this chap standing around me. So finally, after about 5 minutes of waiting, the ET responded and said, "You can go. You are too old and infirm for our purpose." And at this point, Alfred says, I looked around, and when he said, "You can go," I came down. As I was coming down, holding the banister rail on the steps, I felt two joints in it, which gave me the impression that the steps were telescopic and folded up in it. Anyway, I came down and got about 20 or 30 yards from them, and then turned around and watched it. It had a turret on top of it, very much like an inverted saucer, but it looked like a cowl, like you would have on top of a chimney. But instead of going around clockwise, it went anti-clockwise. I carried on back to where my dog and my tackle were, and the first thing I did was to pick up my cup of cold tea and drank it, still watching. I saw it lift up about 300 feet, and it shot off to the southwest over the military cemetery and out of sight. So Alfred says as this object took off, it made a loud whining noise, and other than the initial shock when the beings first approached him, at no time did he feel any real fear. As he says in his own words, "I was more curious than anything. At my age, nearly 78, what have I got to worry about? I can only die once. I had read about UFOs and I didn't believe in them. Up to then, I took the UFOs to be a lot of bunk. Well, I definitely do now, and seeing is believing. I don't give a damn who believes it or who doesn't, but I definitely went into that machine. I definitely wasn't scared, just curious, and I wanted to see what was going on. If they had taken off with me, then it would have been just my lot. It would have been just the same as me going out on the street and being knocked down. I wasn't scared or anything like that. I was just curious. I've spent many years out of doors and tackled many things in Canada. Shot a bear, rattlers, wolves. I don't think I'm scared of anything." Now at the time all of this was going on, Alfred was wondering if these beings, these figures, were perhaps Russian or Chinese spies, and it was only later, after hearing others report UFOs, that he began to wonder about other explanations. Alfred did admit that he was, quote, "mildly disappointed that the ETs had no use for him." But he took the whole experience in stride. After the UFO left, he went on fishing, catching several fish. He walked home. On his way home, he encountered two policemen, told them a little bit about his experience, and they seemed very much believing. In fact, one told him, "Yes, I dare say you did see a UFO. I expect they were checking on our military installations." And as it turns out, there are in fact quite a few military establishments in that area. So Alfred went home, and he wasn't going to tell his wife. Her friend was there. He didn't want to talk about it, but his wife could see that Alfred was quite upset and insisted on knowing what happened. So he did. He shared his story with her, with his wife's friend, also told his son. And later, he wrote to the newspaper, not really sharing his encounter at all, but just asking if anybody had reported any strange lights in the area on that night. And the reporter became curious and actually called Alfred back, and this is how we ended up hearing about this case. Because the newspaper reporter realized Alfred had had a major encounter and referred him to an investigator. Now, Alfred's wife, Marjorie, says, and I quote, "What Alf told you was the absolute truth. My friend who was with me when Alf came home can verify what he said. He looked absolutely shaken, and he told both of us about his experience that he had with the UFO. I was a bit frightened when he told me, but I did not take any more notice. It has been bothering him ever since, and he has been losing sleep over it. He obviously believes what he saw, and I believe him." So after Alfred told his story, she turned to him and said, "No more fishing for you." Now, Alfred was interviewed many times by researchers and reporters, and he told them that it was, quote, "the greatest experience of his life." He did return to the site 2 days later and saw where the UFO had landed that the vegetation was all flattened and in disarray, but not planning on ever telling anybody, fearing ridicule and disbelief, he had no interest in collecting any type of evidence or trying to prove his encounter. He did say that following his encounter, he experienced a loss of appetite and some resulting weight loss. But the case got quite a bit of attention. It was covered in many books, such as by Jenny Randles and Timothy Good. Gordon Creighton, editor of the Flying Saucer Review, writes, and I quote, "It will be noticed that this account contains several features that are already familiar to us from other cases. There is, for example, the central stem or pillar inside the craft, which has appeared on several reports, and has been claimed by some investigators to be a polarized magnetic contraption, intimately related to the secret method of propulsion employed by the ETs, or at any rate, some of them." Now, researcher Hilary Porter visited the site several times over the years and was surprised to see that this area was now being guarded by fully armed soldiers dressed in black. Timothy Good interviewed the witness, Alfred Berthoud, and came away absolutely convinced of the case. As Timothy Good says in his own words, "It is a very important case and quite exciting. I am convinced he is telling the truth, and his was a genuine experience. This is one of the most convincing close encounter cases I have investigated. There is no doubt in my mind that he was taken on board an alien craft." Another investigator who interviewed Alfred in depth is Omar Fowler, and he writes, "We can confirm that a number of the incidents he said occurred are consistent with known UFO characteristics. This is really an exciting case. I believe it to be genuine. I am convinced his story is absolutely true and this actually happened." Interestingly, following Alfred's encounter, there was in fact a wave of sightings in the area. Now, unfortunately, about 3 years following his encounter in 1986, Alfred Berthoud passed away at age 80 after a long illness. But it's certainly an interesting case. One of the more interesting things, I think, is how this witness, Alfred, just like Paolo, described how these rooms were very short in height, too short for a person to even stand up in. So what a case that is. I think it's hard to disbelieve this case, certainly with people like Timothy Good saying that this is a legitimate case, or one of the main investigators, Omar Fowler, calling it one of the best cases he's ever researched. It's a super, super interesting case. And it's really unfortunate that the witness has now passed on, because it would have been very fascinating to speak with him. But wow, what a case. And now we move on to another case, which I call "We Are Your Friends." This is the last case I'm going to be covering today. I don't have the exact location of this case, but it occurred somewhere in the United States, somewhere in the Midwest, I believe, and occurred in the year 1990. This is a singular event I will be describing, but it comes from a witness who's had a lifetime of encounters, who felt it was important to share this one experience to let other people know that they are not alone. And that's certainly one of the reasons I do this research, because I think the onboard experience is far, far more common than most people realize, and most people aren't talking about it. Thankfully, that is changing, thanks to cases like this one. Although the exact date and location of this case is not stated, this is a first-hand account of an onboard encounter from someone who did reveal her real name, Sharon Beals. She's a medical researcher, and I think the case has some important things to teach us about ETs. In an article for UFO Encounters magazine, she wrote about this one experience, and she's had many, of her close onboard encounter. It began one evening around 4:30 a.m., 1990 or thereabouts, when she woke up to hear a loud buzzing noise over the house. And looking up through the skylight, she saw a, quote, fairly large white light moving overhead. This was followed by another smaller one, which was moving in an irregular pattern. Now, being nearsighted, Sharon went to go get her glasses, and it was at this exact moment that her 2-year-old daughter, Kelly, came running in. Now, Kelly had been complaining recently about monsters and, quote, sky monkeys. So she comes running into the room and is holding on to Sharon, and the next thing Sharon knows, hours have passed. She and Kelly are now both waking up, and the previous anxiety that she had been feeling that evening was now replaced by, quote, an absolute sense of peace. But then she found a couple of weird things, which helped her to understand that this had been a much more extensive encounter. She found out that her eyeglasses were completely bent out of shape, as you can see here from Sharon's drawing. And then she went to change Kelly's diapers and was absolutely shocked to see that they were filled with pine needles. This made no sense whatsoever, but it was a clear indication that something had happened. So she decided to seek help. She contacted C. Lee Culver, a hypnotherapist and UFO researcher, and he agreed to place her under hypnotic regression. And it was under hypnosis that she recalled seeing 2 figures come into her room, and the next thing she knows, she and her 2-year-old daughter Kelly are being lifted up into the sky. Sharon then reports feeling a sense of paralysis, an inability to open her eyes, but when she finally was able to, she found herself in a rounded room surrounded by short humanoids with large oval eyes, a small nose, a slit for a mouth, large bald heads, and a long neck and arms. She said they were pale-skinned and were all working quite quietly. There was no real sound at all going on in the room. As Sharon says, it is very quiet. Like everyone has a job and they are very focused, and there doesn't seem to be any emotion. Now, Sharon couldn't see her daughter at this point, but mentally, as though with a telepathic rapport, she could see that Kelly was being physically examined by the ETs on a table. She seemed to be unhappy about it, Kelly, and was resisting it. And the ETs were telling her, it's okay. Don't worry. It's okay. At this point, one of the Greys walked right up to Sharon, placed its face right in front of hers, and stared at her. This is something we do often hear in close encounter reports, and this ET told Sharon telepathically, there's no harm coming to you, to your baby. No harm, no hurt. And then she could physically see her daughter laying on a flat bed. She saw another human boy there being apparently examined. She says she was then taken into another room where she saw this strange looking being sitting behind a desk. This was a little different from the others she had seen. This being had wrinkled skin, tan in color, and had this weird sort of golden V-shaped instrument attached to its forehead. She said that this being had large blue eyes, a very small nose and mouth. It wore a fitted uniform with a star-like emblem on its left chest, and she did have the feeling that this being was the boss, was the one in charge, and it spoke to her, again telepathically, and it said, We've been over and over this. You're safe. You know nothing can harm you. We've been over and over this. You shouldn't be fighting me. You shouldn't be fighting us. We're your friends. You share with us. Do you want to save it or not? Do you want to save the planet? So looking around, Sharon did see several other humans in the room. They were all pretty much sitting in a circle on the floor. She did see her daughter, who was kind of holding lovingly onto her. And it was interesting because nobody in the room seemed afraid or disturbed, though pretty much all of them seemed to be in a trance of some kind. And Sharon was surprised that she appeared to be the only one who was fully awake and aware. Now at this point, an opening appeared in the center of the floor, and everyone started dropping down into separate craft. She said it was almost like a laundry chute. And each person was going into the craft that had taken them up into the bigger craft. And the next thing Sharon knew, it happened to her, and she's standing with Kelly in their front yard. And they walked up to the porch steps and tried to open the front door, but it was locked. They were locked outside. And it was at this moment that something very interesting happened. A large V-shaped craft appeared overhead, and Kelly had the strong impression it was a facilitator. This craft picked her and Kelly up and put them back inside, transporting them through the roof of their home. And as they were set down, her little daughter Kelly sat up and smashed her head against Sharon's glasses, completely bending them out of shape. So now Sharon had her answer, and she knew what happened to her glasses. She knew what happened during this missing time. And following this session, she was absolutely amazed by the depth and detail of her recall. And as she wrote in her article, and I quote, "It's time to find out what's going on. I went to bed that night after the session pondering everything in the universe, God, spaceships, alien beings, and the future of our planet. Lying there, I committed myself to finding the truth behind these lifelong experiences." What I particularly love about that case is the witness gave a very long first-hand account of exactly what happened to her. And she saw quite a few other people on board the craft as well. It does involve her daughter, which shows that this is, as we know, often a generational experience. And a lot of the details she describes are certainly ones we've heard before. It's all around a fascinating case. So there you go. That's our show for today. 5 amazing onboard UFO encounters of all different kinds, involving all different types of ETs, cases coming from all over the world, stretching back decades up to the 1990s. So that's quite an interesting perspective there, and I think teaches us quite a bit about what it's like to have an ET encounter and who these ETs are and why they're here on this planet. I think it's becoming almost undeniable at this point that this is a real thing. Skeptics don't have a leg to stand on. I think if someone is truly skeptical of UFOs and onboard experiences, they simply haven't done their research. The evidence is overwhelming. Disclosure has happened. The ETs have provided us enough information to make solid conclusions about what's going on. We don't need our governments to tell us this is real. There are so many cases. It's already obvious that there is validity to this phenomenon. So there you go. Hope you've enjoyed this episode. I truly appreciate you watching. And as always, please ask those important questions. Keep looking for the truth. And most important of all, keep having fun. Until next time, bye for now.